Neil Roos, a social historian, is Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Bophuthatswana. Additionally, he's the co-implementer of the National Future Professors Programme. We're going to focus on his life as a historian today, where his work is focused on quotidian life in societies marked by great inequality. And unlike most social historians of South Africa, he's interested not so much with those who defied, but rather in the history of beneficiaries and perpetrators, in short, ordinary whites. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you ever so much, Thula, Lindie. It's a great privilege to be talking with friends and colleagues.
Likewise.
Feeling is mutual. So, Neil, please tell us, you were raised as a working class Natalian. So tell us about it, the places, the people, and the formative impact of those years.
Certainly. Lindie, people like myself didn't go to university. In fact, very few of them went to what we now call matric or grade 12. So I came from a working class family, and what is significant about that experience is that, or maybe it was unique about my particular case, where my mother had strong opinions on just about everything, and particularly about class identity, although in a very white South African kind of way. So I was taught to be suspicious of lawyers, of Mercedes-Benzes, never to trust men who played golf, and for that matter, who wore white shoes. But her sense of class never extended to black and white, or to black working classes. And I learned the language of prejudice, which is quite important for a scholar of race, when I was very young. But interestingly enough, it was not prejudice towards black people in South Africa. It was prejudice towards other white people, namely Afrikaans people. And I remember being told as a very young lad that I was not allowed to play with the with the railway children. I did, however, attract friends from other racial sectors of the working class, because we lived at pretty much the intersection of the Group Areas Act, and there were coloured people and Indian people staying sort of literally across the street from us. And among the boys in the neighborhood, we ran around and we did boy things, but these friendships tended to pass as we became teenagers, and as boys who looked like me began the long, ugly path towards conscription through school cadets and so on and so forth. So those were some of my early experiences. I also became interested in the power of symbolism. My father was a war veteran. He was a member of an organization called the Moths, which stands for the Memorial Order of Tin Hats. And none of the war veterans that I encountered from the Second World War spoke very much about their experience. They remembered that experience through performance and ritual. And I became fascinated in watching these rituals as a little boy. I mean, often they looked quite ridiculous rituals to me, and they were cause of mockery, but they had an experience, and I think it shaped partly how I became a historian in later life. So those are some of the influences from that background which shaped me: an interest in ordinary people, an awareness of class, an awareness of the language one uses to isolate other, diminish people, and also an awareness of the symbolic world.
Exactly in Natal.
I lived in two places. I lived in a small sugar milling village called Sizela on the KwaZulu-Natal coast, and I lived in a working class area down towards the Durban docks called Umbilo Road.
You've basically traced a background of ordinary whiteness, but you became an intellectual radical. And what about the growing up experience led you in that specific direction towards radical interpretation of society?
Well, first of all, I was a scholarship boy at school, at high school, and I was a boarder to go along with that. And I had a friend, he was a wonderful man, died far too young, whose mother was in an organization called the Black Sash. And he took me there one Saturday afternoon. We used to sometimes get afternoons off on a Saturday. And this kindly mother giving two 13 or 14-year-olds biscuits or Coke or whatever we got in 1977, and telling us about the Black Sash made me begin to realize there was more to the world than this knee-jerk racism which dominated the language of schoolboy life in 1977. Then I started university in 1982, and my very first day was exactly the day that Neil Agate was murdered. Now, he was a white guy. He had the same name as me, and it was the start on the day of my great new experience. And it made me realize that this apartheid that my friend's mother had spoken about in rather abstract terms killed people. I was soon swept into the activism of student life, of student politics. And most of us dabbled intellectually and politically in Marxism. This is very much a white left, because remember, universities were still largely segregated in those days. And I think that in those days, in the years just after the Soweto generation, the intellectual currents which dominated liberation thought were nationalism and Marxism. And for white students, we were excluded from nationalist debates for all sorts of reasons. So Marxism became the dominant canon. And of course, Rick Turner, by the time I got to University of Natal, where I studied, he was 3 or 4 years dead, but there was still quite a lot of students in the system who'd actually been taught by Rick Turner and were still there. So in a sense, or certainly in my experience and in my recollection, and others may differ with me, although he was dead by then, I would say that Rick Turner was the most important intellectual at the University of Natal still, because his ideas prevailed. His ideas of thinking the possible, of becoming politically engaged, and that massively important but underrated book on the eye of the needle and the importance of utopian thinking. So that was another strand. Then one day I decided to go to a student meeting. I forget which one it was, but I walked into the wrong venue. And instead of the meeting I planned to go to, I arrived at the Black Students Society, which was very, very tightly built around Biko's thought. And I felt rather odd sitting around there. At the end of the session, the speaker called me. He said, "Come here, young man," and he asked what I was doing. Then I explained that I'd got to the wrong meeting and so on and so forth. And he asked if I wanted to learn about Black consciousness, which I did. And in a sense, his conversations with me recentered my teenage Marxism, because I was a young guy when I got to university. I was still 17. And I think that those influences leavened the Marxism which I'd learnt from others. And looking back, I think that I had unwittingly become a little young teenage product, an intellectual product of the Durban moment. I was influenced by Marxism. I was influenced by Black consciousness. And those ideological influences were in turn sharpened by and mediated an awareness of worker and community mobilization, which Turner imprinted upon those he taught and subsequently influenced.
And then, Neil, you took your doctoral degree at the University of Bophuthatswana, not at
Yes.
Wits or UCT or the University of Natal, all these hallowed English institutions. Yes. So that sounds like an interesting trip. How did it get there, or how did you get there? But also, I imagine you also had the shadow of conscription looming over you. Yes. During these years as well.
Yes. I realized very soon as a university student that I was not going to go and serve in the apartheid military. And there were political reasons for that, but to be honest, there were also institutional reasons. I'd come out of boarding school and I didn't want to. I realized what institutional confinement, which is a topic I've written about since, does to people. So there was that reason as well. But I realized I wasn't going to be conscripted under any circumstances, and I ducked and dodged it for as long as I possibly could. I found a doctor who was a kindly man, and less than honest on a medical evaluation, and he gave me a 1-year exemption due to health reasons. And then eventually I ran out of reasons to avoid conscription, and I fortunately managed to get a job at Unibo. Now, one of the of false independence in Bophuthatswana was that the government of the day did not allow the South African police or military authorities to come and arrest draft dodgers. So Unibo became, of all of the so-called bush colleges, Unibo became a little haven for lots and lots of young white men who were not going to be conscripted. I think of Tim Kleinig, I think of Leslie Witz, just in a history department. So there were lots of people of my complexion and politics who ended up there. Now, at the time, I wanted to do a PhD. I arrived there with a master's degree, and I needed to do a PhD, and I fiddled around for a long time about where I wanted to go. And I was beginning, my Marxism was entailed very much a working through of Gramsci and the taken for granted world, and what is taken for granted and what isn't. And the taken for granted route for a fellow like me who had a decent master's, I somehow got a cum laude pass for my MA. It would have been to go to Wits, which was at that stage was by far the best university for historians in the country. But I chose to go to Unibo instead, and it was brought on by practical and academic reasons, and theoretical ones too. Firstly, I thought if I was going to do something on hegemony, it was worth my while to consider, putting my money where my mouth is and not doing the taken for granted thing. And secondly, there was a marvelous social historian at Unibo at the time, a fellow by the name of Tim Kleinig, who left the academy, but he trained under Bonner, and he was really one of the better social historians. He did work on the diamond diggings around Lichtenberg, and I would have liked to have studied with him anyway. So he was at Unibo at the time. So there was a principled reason, but there was also a very practical reason that there was a really good supervisor there, and I do not regret my choice for anything. And I often call Unibo, or as it now is, Northwest, the university of my heart.
Let us just you mentioned you got a job was that a slip of, you said you had a job at Unibo, was that a slip of the tongue, or was it just a scholarship to do the PhD first?
No, it was a job. In those days you could very often get an academic job with a master's degree, okay. And you were expected to get the PhD on the job. So I registered, and it took a couple of years for me to actually, I mean, I started working there, and it took a couple of years for me to actually get going with the PhD, because I was really committed to teaching in the first few years. But I did. I was working as a lecturer then, and I did the PhD while I was on the job. Just as a little aside, we're talking now about the early 1990s, and I saw with great delight that a peer from Unibo, who'd started working a couple of years before me at the institution, got his PhD last year.
Can you narrate for us a little bit about life in Unibo, inside the university, but also in community as well? I'll leave it as an open-ended question for you to paint whatever you like as far as what your memories are of the place and time.
Right. Unibo was a very, very interesting place, and I had some important mentors there, where I learned much of what I know about being a professional academic. We had this absolutely terrifying HOD who was a cloth sister of the church. She was a Dominican, Sister Kathleen Boner, and she taught me a heck of a lot, not least about absolute commitment to students, to putting students at the very, very center of my work there. And I think she would have, if we could have cloned Sister Kathleen Boner, and dropped one of her into each history department, I think she would have had a very strong influence on this kind of sharp-elbowed individual ethic, which we find in universities at the moment. She was a communitarian, she was a Dominican, and we knew what our purpose was there. There were other individuals, a fellow called Andrew Manson, marvelous historian, who demonstrated the demeanor, the generosity, the wide range of interests of being a professional historian. Ralph Magnani, who was always experimenting with new ways of teaching and learning in the classroom when that wasn't very, 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 very popular. So at the time, there was a bit of quite a radical ferment at Unibo, but interestingly, it didn't accrete in the humanities faculty. It was more around education, where there was a lot of thought about what will a post-apartheid education system look like. So although having said that, I'd still regard my major mentor from those early years as Ros Posel, who taught at the University of Natal, and to whom I dedicated my inaugural lecture. Students at Unibo tended to be very progressive. They tended to be very politically engaged. And interestingly, for today, they tended to read. We used to break copyright like mad and go and photograph and then photocopy and then distribute these big, thick readers. This was, of course, before the days of the dreaded textbook. And students would read these things. You know, we'd have stacks of them piled in the office, and students would have to come and sign for them in the beginning of term, and we were giving them in fact, I still have 3 or 4 copies somewhere of Genovese's Roll Jordan Roll, you know. So we'd print those, and no one ever took us to court. I don't think it would happen today, but students were interested in that. There was quite a lot of informal decision making. For instance, we lost several months due to a student strike at one stage. And then for the catch-up plan, it was generated collaboratively by the faculty, the university management, and the students, and we worked a 6-day week. And it's probably the best, most engaged collaborative term I've ever experienced in my life. We all put that term together and we made sure that it worked. Coming from the schooling system in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, students had not been exposed to much African history. So we kind of had a captive market there, teaching African history, where students were really interested in it. They knew very little about South African history and even less about anything north of South Africa. So teaching, the sort of the great lines of African history, the rise of Islam, the rise of great states, slaving, gold production, new historiographies. It was a really wonderful experience. The students were treated very bad. They were often tear gassed. Somewhere in one of my boxes, I've got this great big rubber bullet, a Bob policemen, and they used to call these green bombers because they wore green uniforms, came, and there were students seeking refuge in my office, and the cop shot this tear gas, this rubber bullet thing. They shot tear gas, and then another one shot a rubber bullet in my office, and it ricocheted like a squash ball. Now, what I found as the decade of the 90s morphed is that the idea of liberation, which had marked sort of the students at the beginning of the decade, morphed into quite a strong nationalist turn, and it made someone from the left like me stand out for a little bit. And I still think the student evaluation, which I'm most proud of, it came probably in about 1998. Someone wrote in their evaluation, "Mr. Roos is not a patriot." And if I ever have an epithet, I'd like that. I don't want to be a patriot. So that's pretty much how life was. There were governance crises, but we managed through, and I left when I'd finished my PhD because it felt like time to leave. But it had an imprint. I mean, if one thinks of institutions, and if institutions can have an impact on one on one's personal and professional development, I would say Unibo.
That is so fascinating, and also, just as you said, not the taken for granted story of academic development, and also having to work within those particular times. But then let's look at the doctoral thesis that you then wrote, because it was based on the complexities of ordinary life among white male soldiers, and it sounds like full circle given what you told us about your father.
Yes.
So how and why did you focus on this particular topic, and what came from it?
Well, it starts with my master's degree, when I was beginning to be, at a time when I was beginning to be influenced by the social history movement, but I was also overcome by, especially in the early part of the master's degree, an extraordinary laziness, where I spent weeks on the beach. I think honors was a really hard year. Subsequent to my, I dropped a course from the University of Natal honors, so I was probably a bit burnt out. But anyway, it took me ages to get a topic, and then Professor Dumini, who was professor, summoned me one morning to come and explain what I'd done. I didn't have a topic. So there was a book by Davenport, I forget the name of it. It was a very popular general text on South African history, and I'm paging through it to find a topic. And I saw this stuff on the Torch Commando. So I said, I'm going to write on the Torch Commando. It sounds interesting, and I didn't know anything about it. So anyway, I went to go see Professor Doom here, and he agreed. And I was also at the time being interested in the kind of history being produced at the history workshop, the hidden histories, the histories of resistance, and so on and so forth. So the task for the masters was to try and marry this topic, which I'd come up like this with, to satisfy Professor Dumini, and my growing intellectual and political interest in the social history movement, which led to the earlier work on the Springbok Legion and the Torch Commando, because I realized that, one, you couldn't look at the Torch Commando without the Springbok Legion, and two, the Springbok Legion was actually more interesting. So I wrote the master's on that. But the Springbok Legion as a movement, it was a kind of trade union for largely but not exclusively white soldiers in the Second World War. After the war, it lost its membership, and it was left with a couple of hundred and down to about 60 and 40 by the late 40s of radical whites. And I finished the master's on that, but by the time I got to do a PhD, I was one, drawing closer to anthropology rather than or being influenced by anthropology and my thinking of history. And I began to realize that the majority of soldiers who fought a war against fascism and it came back to live in a racial state were actually more interesting for me than the 40 or 50 or 60 who actually stuck by their guns and properly opposed apartheid. So that's what led to my doctoral thesis on these soldiers, and that thesis eventually became the basis for a book I wrote in 2005 called Ordinary Springboks.
When is the completion of your thesis and then the move away?
I completed from the master's thesis.
No, I'm speaking about the time at Unibo. My understanding is you're there from January 93. Is that correct?
That's correct.
When roughly? Until
early 2000 and was it 2001 or 2002? Okay. I could probably check, but please don't hold me for perjury if I get the year finished, if I get the year wrong. But I graduated in September of the 1 year. I'd already applied for a post at WITS in academic development, and I'm actually still waiting for them to respond. Their admin does seem a little slow. And I applied for a job at Pretoria. I'd interviewed and got it and started at Pretoria in April of the next year.
You have been influenced by the Comaroffs. And you mentioned that you're influenced in anthropology, and that was central to your historical practice. In what ways, and how do you view the interdisciplinary nexus between the two?
I was initially influenced by the Comaroffs. I mean, I first knew them as a name, but my partner was a Comaroff student, and I got to meet the Comaroffs first through visiting Chicago and attending the seminars which they held at their house. They, in about 1997, 98, around there, maybe a little earlier, 96 perhaps, they came and they had a year's sabbatical, and they were our neighbors in Mafeking. And I was very interested in their sort of historical ethnography. They often in those times when they'd come when they'd come and speak, they'd introduce themselves as humble historians, which, I mean, that's not the Comaroffs, but that's how they would introduce themselves. But I was interested by their own approach to theory and methodology and the entry points they used, because their work, although they weren't historians in the sense that we are, their work has always been deeply historical. And I was interested in their approach to historical transformation, in their emphasis on contexts and the place of capitalism in driving the change in contemporary Southern Africa. Later on, Bernard de Bald, who works at Stellenbosch University, wrote what I think is an exceptionally good essay. And he says that for him, the legacy of E.P. Thompson in South Africa is more evident in the Comaroffs' work than it is in the social historians' work, which is a very interesting take. And he particularly points out how the Comaroffs theorize and write about class formation away from metrics, with an emphasis on consciousness, with an emphasis on context. In other words, softer, if one wants to call it, more malleable notions of class, in itself than class in a more mechanistic kind of sense. And I was very, very influenced by that. And I've tried to write in that way for much of my career.
Following on that, Neil, this turn towards, the strands of anthropology and historical ethnography.
Yes.
You were also one of the first South African historians to start engaging with the theoretical literature around whiteness. And I will admit, I've always felt a bit conflicted about it. So I would like to know what is your interpretation, your views, or your take on it, and also what value did it add to the work that you have done?
I must say a lot of the work on whiteness in South Africa, especially the more sociologically inclined work on whiteness, I've not taken to it very much. It writes in broad strokes. It doesn't differentiate. And we are left with overgeneralization. And I was at a conference once, and the organizers had invited Ferial Haffajee, the journalist, to present a keynote. And she said, like, what is this stuff? I mean, you folk are navel gazing. Do you really expect anyone to be interested in this? And I kind of agree with her. So in a sense, my approach has not been to whiteness as such. I'm more interested in histories of whites. And it emerged in a very strange way. The Comaroffs arranged for me to have a fellowship during my doctoral study at Brown University, where their son-in-law, Lewis Gordon, was head of what they called Afro-American Studies at the moment, and was an enormously generous community. And I sat in the doctoral class for the term I was there. And we read widely on the canons and the literature, Du Bois, Fanon, Ida B. Wells Barnett, James Baldwin, and so on. Now, in the seminar, the group knew that I was working on whites, and they were constantly pushing and saying, all right, now we've read this book. What questions does that text raise for you about white people? And it was a combing against the grain for both of us, and an enormously rich experience. And in a sense, they affirmed what I was studying, but they also gave me an important lesson, one which I think runs counter to some but not all of the studies in the so-called whiteness genre in this country. My peers and the professors I encountered at Brown were quite emphatic that histories of whites aren't intrinsically interesting, nor are they of any particular historiographic or moral or political value, and that they only take shape and they only take meaning when they're framed within broader questions about the development, the production, the resilience, and the adaptability of a racial order. And indeed, when they expose the cost of white supremacy, not only to black people, but to white people as well. In other words, they were saying, yes, focus on white people, and then you welcome in this group. But it's actually what you're really doing is a history of race. And if you're not doing a history of race, if you're just talking about white people, please go elsewhere. And it's a lesson which I've tried to keep in my own work. Well, since then, it's I think one of the better ones I've learned. And it was only later that I became immersed in the so-called whiteness American literature, written by people like David Rodiger and Noel Ignatieff. But my first approach to this was in the Afro-American Studies department at Brown.
We like to keep a special place for the book in this podcast series. So please tell us about Ordinary Springboks, the process to publication, finding a publisher, and that whole journey, and what was that like?
Right. I kind of realized that I wanted to get a book out, which was not that common among younger historians. And I was younger then. I had more hair than this and than I do now. At the time, but I realized I wanted to get a book out. So I started writing to a couple of publishers very tentatively, and most didn't reply, but Ashgate did. And this was in the May of the year I'd started at Unibo. And I remember because I'm not at Unibo, sorry, at the University of Pretoria. And I remember because it was the day of my birthday. It was quite a nice birthday present. And they gave me the contract, and I was delighted about this. Jonathan, who was dean at Pretoria, was delighted about it. And he even wrote to the vice chancellor, who put a notice out on whatever the bulletin at Pretoria was called at the time. So I was very proud of myself, and I then went to go and speak to Professor van Onselen, and he sort of gruffly said, "Very well done, young man, but you can expect 2 years of very hard work." And I thought this was just Professor van Onselen being Professor van Onselen, but really it took me 2 years to rework that. And I've seen that with a lot of scholars who do work up a PhD. If you want to make it something that looks like a book and not just a PhD between boards, then you kind of do need between 1.5 years and 2 years. Ashgate were a marvelous publisher to work with. There was a marvelous editor. Now, they were a little bit hands-off with the editing process, but what they did do is they got it out to reviewers very, very well. And that's something that I would like to urge any young historian who's going for a publisher. Number one, you have to get a publisher that's got a decent reputation, because you spend so much time and sweat and blood writing this thing, and it's no more work preparing a text for a rotten publisher or for Cambridge University Press. So go for the best publisher that you can, and also go for one that gets a good network of reviews, because what we learn in this game is that the goalposts keep on changing. First we're told we have to get a PhD, then we're told that well done, now to be counted you have to have a book, and you get the book out and you go and show the dean, and dean says jolly well done, but really let's wait till the reviews come out. So one has to go for a publisher that's got a demonstrable record of getting good reviews. And that was my experience with Ashgate. And I'm very, very grateful for them. Although I don't quite know if Ashgate are still publishing, because when I was preparing my rating document last year, I found Ordinary Springboks with a Routledge imprint and a blue cover. Now, it's not the cover which I had on the book when it came out. So, but that's neither here nor there. Ashgate were a really, really good publisher to work with.
And then you have the book out. Mm-hmm. We are into the early 2000s. And you've spoken about the reaction against social history in the early 2000s, but you still find value there. And I will admit, I've recently just taught Max Weber and Karl Marx and had a whale of a time rediscovering those texts. They still speak to me, but is this antiquarian or anachronistic? What is your opinion?
Lindie, I don't think it's antiquarian. I don't think it's anachronistic. And the reason I've stuck with social history is that I'm interested in how the so-called unhistoried people, the subaltern people, go about world making. And it doesn't always coincide with elite visions. And I think that the histories, the world making of the unhistoried, often interrupts or bypasses the visions of the lettered. So I have an abiding interest in those perspectives. And as I think just about every bit of history shows, that societies are made not just from the top, but also from below. Even if we're talking about race making, my work, to speak because I know it, and many others shows it goes beyond what Jeffrey Cronje or H.F. Verwoerd or Milan or anyone spoke about. That's never, their visions of race are never quite what shapes the world and how it operates. So I'm interested in what from below brings to world making. And I think also this notion of worlds of possibilities. I've always been interested in the political possibility of history from my early days influenced by the social history moment. And I do believe that for those who are interested in an activist and an interventionist history, studying the lives of the unhistoried shows us agency. It shows how you and I and the working class people we encounter and the cleaning corps at the university, the security personnel can and do shape worlds. They show new ways of imagining the past. They show new ways of imagining the present and the future. And for me, those are very, very important tasks of the discipline. And I think we lose those when we go for more elite visions, and text-based histories.
Some have spoken about the 90s and 2000s representing a crisis within the discipline, although others disagree with that. Was the crisis real? How did you experience it?
In a sense, I was aware of it, but it didn't affect me on an absolute day-to-day basis, because in a sense, in that period, I was stuck out in Unibo. So we missed a lot of the hot debates that might have been happening at the clever places like Wits in Pretoria and so on. But of course, I was aware of it. And what I saw is a retreat from social history and almost an embarrassment about Marxism, a retreat from the archive, which came from the critique about how can we know the voice of the subaltern, a retreat from ethnography, again from the how can we know the lives of the subaltern, and this move to texts. So what happens in the lives of the unhistoried, of the subaltern, of the ordinary people, of some of the subjects who'd begun to feature in Africanist historiography from the 60s, is that we find histories being written which are, in the words of the famous Indian historian Sumit Sarkar, a dull hagiography of the subaltern. And for me, that was a very troubling position. And in a sense, as new elite top-down literature, text-driven histories became trendier, especially in American universities, one historian, it might have been Jeff Ely, but again, please don't quote me on that because it might be someone else. But one important commentator from the left talks about historians losing their nerve in the 90s. And we can see it in lots of ways. We can see there's a move. A lot of the work which is published actually looks like work which had been published in the 70s. And we can see it, and you know, in a lot of the currents, in the rise towards histories of the North, the resurgence of imperial histories, the histories of someone's writings in someone's writings about their travels in Botswana and so on. And so there's and of course, I'm characterizing positions here because some of the work which comes out is massively sophisticated. And I think, for instance, of the work of Isabel Hofmeyr, just for argument's sake. But there is a retreat from the archive, a retreat from the methods of ethnography, and a retreat from trying to reconstruct these pasts. And there's the wonderful riposte which comes out, and again, I can't remember the source at the moment. Spivak says, can the subaltern speak? Someone responds to her, can the theorist listen? And for me, that was, I mean, it was kind of humorous, but it was a strong theoretical point. And we do as best we can, and we do as best we can to listen, and that's our job and our skill as historians, or certainly social historians, or historians with an interest in ethnography and anthropology. We're not perfect. This is an incomplete discipline, and that's why we have a discipline, because the next person who comes on is going to do and writes on this topic is going to do a better job. That's how disciplines grow. Not only history. The physicist is not perfect, nor is the historian. And that's the joy of the discipline, I believe, the possibility of it.
Indeed, I cannot agree more. But now it's also interesting, we speak of the crisis of the 1990s and 2000s, and you say, well, you weren't as much in the thick of it in Bophuthatswana, but then you moved to the University of Pretoria. So tell us about Tukkies as a place
right.
in those times.
I moved to Tukkies, but it's interesting, and you may or you may not know, I didn't ever work in the history department at Tukkies. I worked in the education department, where Professor Jansen recruited me, and I went to an interview there, and I'd never met Professor Jansen before, and I was on the way to the interview, and I saw a large black man sitting on the steps in the education building on the main campus eating a pie. Then he greeted me quite amiably, and I walked up, and only to find that he was chairing the interview panel sort of 10 minutes later, still wiping pie crumbs from his lips. But anyway, he was very worried that education at the time at Tux had become very inbred. Everyone who was there had a PhD in education, and everyone there had their PhD from either UP, Stellenbosch, Free State, or Potchefstroom University. So he wanted to thicken the blood a little bit. I'd been writing on education, and he wanted to bring people who'd been writing on education, but from other disciplines. So I came in, and I didn't quite fit. And it's a position which I've found has been a very productive position for me, on working from the margins, so I could range a little bit in what I wanted to write. And the education in Pretoria at the time was a marvelously exciting place to work. Lots of very interesting scholars passed through there, attracted by Jonathan, and he did a lot to create some intellectual life in the faculty, to create some turmoil, to create circulation, and he gave me lots of opportunities as well, not least to take a Fulbright when I hadn't earned the leave. And it's something I pass on as well as a dean these days. But eventually I felt a little bit isolated in education because there were people working on histories of education, but not that many. So I did eventually, it did eventually sort of move on from, or find that it was a little stifling, at which point the dean at the time, Professor Eloff, and the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research, Professor Crew, agreed that I would go and assist Professor Crew with postgraduate studies across the university.
You mentioned that you were never absorbed by the history department, but did you have any interaction? Was there any sort of informal networking of historians at Tukkies where you could sort of... You mentioned Charles Van Onselen, who gave you the advice regarding the Ashgate book, but beyond that, with the department itself?
I didn't have a lot of interaction with it. You know, I knew Corin because everyone knows Corin because she organizes things, and you know, she was just kind to me. I knew Professor Berg in his rather courtly, courteous way. He was always immensely kind and respectful, but I'm sure he had absolutely no idea what I worked on, except that I was a historian of some sorts. But Van Onselen is probably the historian who I had the closest interaction with, and he taught me a lot besides history. He taught me about academic generosity, which is something I try and pass on. There's a courtyard in the University of Pretoria where Professor Van Onselen was inclined to take coffee some morning, and I was walking with a copy of a paper, and Van Onselen was there drinking a cup of coffee, and he called me over, and we were chatting for a moment over a cup of coffee and complaining about things about the University of Pretoria and the discipline and the archives and so on. And then I mentioned briefly this paper, which was a first version of my work colonies paper, and that I didn't quite know if it was going to fly. And Professor Van Onselen asked me if I had a copy, and I said, well, yes, this in my hand. This is exactly what I've got. So they said, well, give it to me. And I gave it to him, and that afternoon I received a 5-page review of the essay from Professor Van Onselen. Now, who could ask for better feedback and better collegiality and more kindness than that? But actually, with the history department, I didn't have a whole lot to do. Although, having said that, I was very often able to, moving into a new phase of work, often able to talk at the department and present close to first drafts of papers there. I think at the time, you, Thula, were a postdoc, or had you started when I was there? I know we met when you were a postdoc.
2007 was my first.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was starting to sort of move out of education more into working in Professor Crew's office. But with the actual, you know, with the faculty, I didn't have a whole lot of connection because we weren't working historiographically in the same register or on similar topics.
But then you mentioned when you met Thula as a postdoc, but
yes.
I met you also as a postdoc.
That's correct, yes.
At the International Studies Group at the University of the Free State. And
that's right.
That was something, you know, a very interesting project. And you mentioned your experience with Jonathan Jansen at UP, and he had become the Vice-Chancellor at Free State by that time, and had said, you know, the International Studies Group was established. But please tell me about your story there, your involvement and your time at Free State.
I got to Free State as founding director of the postgraduate school, which worked for a bit, but in the swirls around Jonathan's leadership, there were factions and at the University of the Free State, which I was brought in as one of Janssen's hires, and I was caught in one of those, and I don't wish to dwell on that. But the point is that I said to Jonathan that I don't want to do this job anymore. So he said, okay, well, would you like to move to the International Studies group or the History department? So I asked if I could go to the International Studies group, and it was a weird experience because while I was in the International Studies group, I often, although I was already an associate professor by then, I felt more like a postdoc. However, it was a very rich time, and it exposed me to more historiographies than I'd worked on before. I felt as a senior scholar there, I needed to engage more. So I read a whole lot more widely than I would have elsewhere, otherwise. I supervised on topics from Nigerian history to Ghanaian to Zimbabwean history. And I also later, after I was evicted from the International Studies group, on the word of the Dean and the Vice Chancellor, to the History department. So I was told that I'd not done anything. You need to, these arguments which we found in universities that you need to earn your salary. So anyway, I went to the History department to earn my salary, and it was probably a very traumatic move. It was the most traumatic move of my academic career, that encounter with the Dean and the Vice Chancellor. But then Dr. Twala was tremendously supportive and generous, and I also took over editorship of the then Journal of Contemporary History, which I tried to turn it around. And we worked up to a sense. We wanted to try and make it a vehicle to publish Southern versions of African history, which felt different to Northern narratives. But I think in a sense we failed because we didn't do the adequate theory work at the journal, but we did have some success. We returned the journal to history, whereas previously it had become a dumping ground for retired white political scientists, sociologists, philosophers who were chowing the subsidy. If you could publish 3 articles a year or 4 articles a year, then that's some rather good subsidy money. We published some great essays. We featured some younger scholars, and I think we did go some way towards hosting a more continental community of younger scholars. So in a sense, I was quite proud of the work we did there, although with reservations, because we didn't manage the theoretical shift which I hoped we could.
I will say, though, my experience was, I experienced the intellectual academic generosity of which you spoke, because you being the senior scholar and us learning to supervise postgraduates ourselves, we always felt comfortable and free to send our students to you for further advice or more insight or discussions just to broaden their concept of their studies. So always knowing that generosity was there, I will say was something I saw and learned, and I still believe in that. Again, send your students out to speak to as many academics from various backgrounds as possible to enrich their own work.
That's very kind, Lindie. I didn't realize that, but it's something that I like to do personally, and I also do it with my own scholars. It's by and large, scholars. And I'm really not trumpet blowing here, but the stronger, more confident scholars are delighted when younger scholars approach them for their insights. That's been my experience. It's the sort of mid-range and the bottom feeders who put you off with make an appointment or write me an email. But if you write to Jeff Ely or Paul Gilroy or someone, they're usually helpful. That's and in my case, Van Onselen. And again, you know, in becoming a scholar, it's not just where you publish, it's not just what you teach. There are a set of dispositions which I think are important to cultivate when we think about what it means to be a professional scholar.
I know I want to approach this, and it'll maybe take a couple of attempts to ground it properly. I know that UP was very interested in emulating the success of the ISG that you'd achieved at Free State. I've always viewed it as being kind of initiative which would be critically important for historiography and very dynamic. But the sort of reading between the lines of what you're saying, it was a difficult fit sometimes with regards to University of Free State, and there were issues about where it aligns with the history department. Am I reading the vibes rightly or wrongly, that it was you had to fight for your place within the institutional firmament, or not? Please feel free to give as much or as little detail.
We did have to fight for the place, and again, Jonathan was quite a divisive character at the University of the Free State. He brought in Professor Phimister, which was one of his better moves, and Professor Walker for that matter, in the field of human development and higher education studies. But it was, given that it was his decision, it was always going to be contentious. The faculty at the time was not particularly interested in hosting Professor Phimister. So the point is they recruited him, and then there was no certainty as to where he would fit within the, you know, within the academic structure. So the unit got set up, and it was a marvelous place. It produced some wonderful historians, including, to date, the only 2 P-rated scholars in history that rating systems ever assessed. But it never quite fit in the faculty. I think it was up to the time I left, it was tolerated more than embraced, I felt. Tolerated because of its very excellence. And the fact that it made the faculty look good, but it wasn't, I mean, in my old age, I've become a dean, and if I'd been dean and I had a unit like the International Studies group at hand, I would have managed it in very different ways. You know, so it survived. I think it survived and it thrived despite the institutional apathy.
How would you have managed it? What would be the ideal fit for us?
I would have brought it far closer into the faculty. I would have had a circulation between the fellows in the International Studies group and the history department. I would have centralized its seminars and brought in scholars from other disciplines because a lot of the scholars in other disciplines were publishing at a fairly low level. But the international studies scholars, I can't recall anyone ever publishing in a low tier journal. So I would have used that institution to draw in scholars from sociology or politics or whatever other discipline there were, to elevate, you know, the kind of scholarship across the faculty. And I would have also permitted it to work as a kind of center within the faculty for advanced studies, where if we have a smart sociologist working, let's say on the impact of the withdrawal of US funding on HIV support in Southern Africa, and I'm using that as an example from one of the scholars in my faculty currently, I would have put them in the international studies group for 6 months or a year to incubate it. You know, Jackie and I worked with the concept of intellectual incubators, and how valuable they are, and how you grow excellence in incubators. But unfortunately, given that institutional apathy at Free State, the International Studies Group, while being probably the finest incubator for historians in Southern Africa, the institution didn't make full use of it. And it says nothing about the International Studies Group, except it was brilliant, and it was well run, and it was inspirational working there. But it says lots about what an institution looking at a resource and not making use of it. It's crazy.
I think my sense was also more or less the International Studies Group was essentially parachuted into Bloemfontein. You know, Professor Vermister and Professor Walker with her center that was, you know, for higher education that was also set up. Both of these units were, you know, they shared a building, but with no one else. So it's a separate building away from the faculty, as you said. None of the scholars in the ISG had studied at the Free State at all. That's part of what made it so good, because it came from all over. But there were no institutional pre-existing links, and I agree with you. It was one worked in isolation with very few opportunities to integrate into the wider faculty. Some of us did manage to some extent. But also the other interesting shift is, you know, a lot of the historians in the history department have since left or retired, and now there is a move of ISG scholars into the history department, and one hopes for the best in that regard.
One does. And I'm very pleased to see, because, and I can think of Professor Masakure, I can think of Dr. Gwande, I can think of Dr. Pasmeers, I can think of Dr. Schwartz, just for four of them who have come through the ISG, and they're now working in the history department. And all of them are first-rate historians. Plus, of course, those who've gone on to work in other universities. So in a sense, the ISG has been producing historians of the region, but often they've had to go to other institutions, and again, it's the institution not making full use of it. And I don't think that they were really parachuted in. You know, they were brought in, and it was quite a while. And there was a third leg to that group. Remember, Professor Pumla Goboro Marikizela was also brought in. So these scholars came in, and they actually built. You know, so they weren't coming as like a science group where Professor Bloggs arrives with 5 or 6 postdocs and doctoral students already. So these were built from the ground up. But so the professors were hired, but and then the units were built. But there was never much enthusiasm in the faculty for certainly at the time I was there. Hopefully things have changed. You know, there's a new dean and a new vice chancellor. But I worried a bit about that at the time. I thought the institution could have done far better in utilizing the incubating power of these groups.
I want to just speak about decolonization and the FeesMustFall movement. How did that impact you?
I think that the FeesMustFall movement made us think very, very carefully about what we write. And notably, it made us ask new questions about race, about privilege, and about power. By the time the FeesMustFall movement, I think it marked an intellectual crisis as well as a money crisis. And the Rhodes Must Fall movement as well, which we shouldn't entirely fold the two into each other. But there was a promise of freedom which remained elusive, intellectually, financially, logistically, that poorest students weren't getting into universities, that we'd had, what by that stage, it was 26 years or so of after apartheid, yet they were still experiencing racism, they were still experiencing alienating curricula. So that's what I mean when it was an epistemic crisis as much as a logistical and financial one. So I think that they also were very sensitive to how white supremacy was transforming itself, especially in liberal institutions. And this is something that people like David Goldberg and others have written about, how racism is incredibly resilient to changing circumstances. So there was a very common demand intellectually to unmask and expose whiteness. This language of kill whiteness, which we found at the time, was really, I think, a deep claim to show, to explain what is going on. How is the system still working? You know, it's nowhere, but it's everywhere. So we needed to ask new ways. We needed to have new ways of thinking about race. Certainly for a historian in my position, that's what it said. But also in the broader decolonization moment, which came around in the wake of the Roads Must Fall. And there's an important parable there. That's often student mobilization and student activities that make scholars think and write. That's where the initiative came. It wasn't from scholars, it was from students. I think there was a humanist strand within the decolonization work that notes that segregation and apartheid dehumanizes both black and white people. And they ask how we might write histories which challenge the binaries of race that organized modern South Africa, and how these histories, as they are, hollow out the humanity of everyone, which is an insight which comes directly from Du Bois, when Du Bois himself writes that actually the worst victims of racism are white working people who learn not to love humanity and to hate. Well, he uses the pejorative term at the time, black people. So he's interested in and as was Biko actually, and Rick Turner, interested in writing which exposes the lies and hold people into these black people and white people into these structures of white supremacy. And I think that for me, that was a very exciting moment. It was a timely wake-up call. And in 2016, I went to go and speak at Stellenbosch, and someone asked me that question, like how can you be talking about whites? Well, I said, actually, we talk about whites, but let's talk about race. Why aren't we talking more about race at the moment? This is exactly the underlying structure, which is retaining the toxins which poison the body politic, which keep inequality in place. So for me, it was a really useful time to ask new questions about race and to think about new historiographies, to think about how racism exists beyond the state, are produced and reproduced in people's everyday lives, in the kind of neutral regulations which govern universities. Financial regulations or residence regulations, they don't mention race at any university. But you go and ask the black students, and they'll show you exactly how these regulations discriminate against them. So those are the kinds of terrains which I think that movement forced the historian of race into. I don't feel the the I don't feel that battle is nearly won, but I think it certainly prompted us to think of new historiographies.
I agree with you, Neil. I think Rhodes Must Fall, actually, even more than Fees Must Fall, forced me to rethink. Again, as a biographer, I began thinking of, statues falling, and the extent to which these statues represent individuals, but these individuals are really symbols. And how do we go about using individual histories or biographies as symbols for wider discourse, and it's Rhodes Must Fall that brought me to that. But talking of new questions being asked, you then moved from having published Ordinary Springboks to Ordinary Whites. So please tell us of the journey from the one to the next.
Okay, so I think that I'd finished writing Ordinary Springboks, and it had raised a couple of questions for me, particularly the question of how many of the soldiers claimed to be anti-apartheid, especially the ones in the Torch Commando, yet they had no problem with white supremacy. But I battled with the conceptual language for that. Then I got to Chicago, to the University of Chicago, where I came across all sorts of new historiographies, and I wrote very little when I was at Chicago, but I asked lots and lots of questions, and I read. That was the basis of my sabbatical there. And first, I think probably one of the most important bits of work I came across was the work of German historians post Tim Mason, who were writing on German life under the Nazis. And this is the importance, which I've stressed even when I was in the international studies group, of reading outside of your area. It doesn't mean that one needs to write comparative histories in the George Frederickson model, comparing segregation in South Africa and the American South, but often we find that historians of other contexts ask questions which are useful for us. And I call that small c comparison. Well, the work on Nazi life, on life under the Nazis, on working life under the Nazis, gave me some of those small c questions, which was, how do working people, which I later used as the idea as ordinary white people, how do they make accommodation with authoritarian regimes? And in a sense, it moved me away from the social history movement, because the South African social history movement had always asked the resistance question. How do people resist? How do they mobilize? How do they protest? How do they survive? Whereas I was saying, actually, after reading the Germans, and bear in mind, I've never had an original thought in my life. So everything I take, I crib from somewhere. So the Germanists, like Jeff Ely, for instance, like the late Professor Alf Lütke, were asking questions about accommodation. And adjacent to that, which I perhaps asked maybe more than some of the Germanists, maybe less, but how can you make accommodation while simultaneously showing elements of defiance, elements of resistance, elements of indocility? So that was my model for approaching what was going to be a new history. So, and I'm good and well now. So twiddling my thumbs, walking around in the cold in Chicago, and I've got a theoretical model, but I've got no idea what I was going to look at. I mean, I kind of knew where I wanted to go, and that was going to be the framework which moved on from the question which ordinary Springboks had left me. And I initially wanted to do a big study on the apartheid civil service. So I get home and I get into the archives, and I I hate saying the word discover, because it makes me sound as fraudulent as Christopher Columbus. But then I'm sitting in the archives, and for me it was a discovery because I didn't know anything about it. The story of the work colonies, I hadn't heard about anywhere. So I start digging this up while I'm still keeping a pile on the civil service, but I've got another pile which is growing on the work colonies. And from that, I realize that there are a couple of stories which need to be told here. One is how we talk about this accommodation, which a lot of the archival material on the civil service testifies to, but the work colonies show us something else as well, that the state was actively going about disciplining, punishing, reforming people in a more Foucauldian type of sense. And that becomes, I think, the sort of core pillars of the work. On the one hand, how do we have accommodation? And there's strong material foundations for it. But on the other hand, if you don't buy into that, what are the consequences? And the consequences are, in the case of white men who ended up in the work colony, that you go for a 3-year holiday at Zonderwater, which wasn't very pleasant. And those are the major processes, the historical processes, which I looked at in ordinary whites, in the essays which make it up. And I think that they emphasized what was and is, for me, an important theoretical point, that race making happens from above and from below.
Well, it's interesting, Neil. I recently read a memoir in Afrikaans. I don't know if you are familiar with the, we'll call it columnist, journalist Dana Snyman. So he's a national treasure within the Afrikaans community. And he has now, for the first time, published something of a memoir, but in particular, his very short experience of conscription. But what he uncovers there, as I read the memoir, I was reading you at the same time, because of your arguments with regards to ordinary whites and the worker colonies. Because what he details there is when young conscripts, if they resisted their training, would be seen as mentally unstable,
yes,
sent to one military hospital, be labeled as schizophrenic, and be rejected from the army, but then also rejected from society.
Yes, very much
and
so.
That just told me straight away, again, this is a form of, control, but also ostracizing, the unwanted young white men who do not fit the mold. And I just felt that having your ordinary whites gave me that particular angle of looking at this memoir. And then it's one of those cases where once you see it, you don't unsee it. You start seeing it everywhere. Yeah. And I think that is part of the strength of your work. The question also is, how has ordinary whites been received?
It's quite interesting. It's it's been reviewed. It's been reviewed. Okay. I'm pleased and flattered by the reviews and flattered by some of them, but it's been quite well received by the sort of liberal and educated elites. The kind who attend book launches, although some say that it's hard reading, and I haven't quite figured out if they mean that it's the text, it's like literally hard to unpick the grammar or the concepts, or whether it's hard on the heart, which is another kind of reading. I have encountered elements of denialism and anger. that take the following forms: that not all whites are like that, that we were opposed to apartheid all the way along, which is the Nuremberg fallacy, that one was an anti-Nazi in the heart, that it's all past now, that it wasn't all that bad, that there were other kinds of whites, and whataboutism, that, well, if this was so bad, look, what about the corruption now and the fact that there's a pothole on the corner of 11th Street and Santon Drive, or whatever the case might be. So there has been quite a lot of pushback from middle class white folk. But what I found particularly endearing is some ordinary white folk, the kind of people who I write about, have given remarkable feedback. And there's this network in academic departments in a lot of places where it's working class people, black and white, who occupy the sort of front offices and departments and faculties. And often you send something to a colleague, who I might send something to you, and things get printed, and the administrator reads this. And from more than one university administrator, I've had comments coming back, usually via the person who I've sent it to, that these individuals are impressed, not impressed, but they're moved by the book because they see people like them in the history. So that was one of the objectives. I wanted to bring history into the realm of people's experience, that they could recognize Uncle so-and-so, or Auntie so-and-so, or grandfather so-and-so in these characters that I write about. So that's the kind of reactions which I have had, and they've been class-based, but so it's kind of mixed reactions, I suppose.
Do you think ordinary South African whiteness has been affected at all by the sort of international trends since the sort of FeesMustFall? The great global trend has been towards the right in many Western democracies. And
that's very interesting that you ask that question, because I've spent the last year twiddling my thumbs and thinking about what to do. And what is increasingly troubling me is the rise of a global right, a white right. And it's the language of that movement sounds like the language of late apartheid. It's kind of racial yet non-racist language. It's coded language. It's got similar types of fear, of paranoia, of privilege, of expectation, of entitlement. And what I'm beginning to do, and I'll probably not, it probably won't ever see the light of day, but at least it's occupying my little brain at the moment, is that I'm interested in looking at white people who grew up as Oranje Blanje Blou was falling down. White people of my generation, Lindie's generation, of, if I had children, my children, young people who are at university. And I want to do a social history of those individuals. But as you might be aware, each of my books has tried to ask a bigger theoretical historiographic question. And in answering this question and tracking the social histories of these individuals, not only in this country, but as they leave, as they go to certain venues in the United States, Texas, Tennessee, Australia, New Zealand, I want to look at how particular variants of being white and claims for privilege have shifted from the state, as the racist state has collapsed in South Africa, to becoming a type of global power, of global discourse. So that's really where my interest is going at the moment. And I said that probably the work will never see the light of day, but that's the sort of questions which I'm interested in at the moment.
Oh, that I find, well, fascinating, and I agree. And what comes to mind straight away is actually, you probably know him, the philosopher Johan Rousseau at UFS, his short novel Verwoerdburg. And it's premised on the idea of this generation that was raised for conscription, and then conscription fell away just as they left school. And then it becomes the story of, we were raised for a particular order, but then as we graduate into the adult world, this order fell away. And, you know, those are interesting questions. But now also where it becomes contentious then is these, as part of the global white right, these growing narratives of white victimhood. So tongue in cheek, would you consider taking up Donald Trump's offer of refugee status? And what do you think has he missed about the ordinary white experience?
Well, no, I wouldn't. I've had a long love affair with America, but I can't imagine myself becoming a refugee, because I'm not a refugee. I'm a very privileged elderly man, living beyond the expectations of my talents. But what Donald Trump misses is that racial redress is not racism. That's the first point. We live in a deeply racist society that's hardly changed structurally since apartheid. So we need redress now more than ever. The second thing he misses is that we live in one of the most, if not the most, unequal societies in the world, and the fault lines of inequality are largely racial fault lines. The third thing he does wrong is that he listens to, well, the products of those who grew up under the fall of the Oranje Blanje blow, who themselves are complaining about the loss of privilege. So he's listening to the wrong voices. And I think we must state quite unambiguously, if I had to speak to Donald Trump today, and if he decided to share a cheeseburger with me, I'd point out to him that there's no racist laws in this country. There's racial redress, but there's no racist laws. That whites in this country remain massively privileged. If you look at the statistics, if you look at who gets jobs, we've got a lot of tracer studies from the universities about which graduates get jobs and which don't. And also, if we look at land holding, I think that would be the last point I'd make, and I'd hopefully not have anything more to say to him or with him or about him after that.
Let's speak as we get into the home straight now. Your position as Dean of the Humanities and Social Sciences at Fort Hare. What do you feel are the principal challenges that exist in terms of raising the next generation of humanists, and how they reflected at the Alice campus? Is that and your other campuses? I think you've got an East London one as well.
Yes, we do. Yeah. I think many years ago I learned a very important lesson. I went to the newest campus of the University of California system, which is in a place called Merced, which it's like going into the Karoo. It's not San Francisco, LA, California. It's in the middle of nowhere. But what they said is that Berkeley and UCLA have had more than 100 years to accumulate lots and lots of city money, build up large disciplines, and we're going to be darn silly if we try and be a new Berkeley or new UCLA. What we need to do is to be distinctive, to focus on it. And within a decade, they had 2 of their institutional programs in the top 10 in the United States. An important lesson, and I call it the sort of Merced lesson. So what we're trying to do at the University of Fort Hare is we've spent a long time doing structural rebuilding, and we've got really good governance and academic structures now, but our job now is to ensure that it's not business as usual, that we approach very intentionally what we mean by the humanities and the social sciences at the University of Fort Hare. We don't want to be rural versions with of what happens at the University of Pretoria or Wits University. Not that there's anything wrong with or that we're critical of at those universities, but it's simply that as dean, it's my ambition that we think intentionally of what we do, rather than accepting again these taken for granted ideas of what the disciplines should mean. So we might need to think about whether the old academic structures such as faculties work. I've come across universities which have done away with faculties. Brown University in America allows students to register across campus. The University of Technology in Sydney. We need to think about the questions which we're asking. Are we addressing some of the grand challenges in society? But we also need to absolutely defend the space for small questions. We can't all go and ask questions about the SDGs and something. That's we're not an earnest NGO or government department. We're a university, and if someone wants to study happiness or some other effect in poetry, then they should be encouraged and supported to do so. So I think what we're doing is, one, we're trying to think of the new what it is that we want to focus on in the humanities. And given my own, I suppose, style as a scholar, I'm very keen to push the departments on what theoretical, methodological, and epistemological repertoire they need for that. It's not good enough to say we need to look at housing patterns or climate or sustainability or whatever the case is. How are you going to do that? What disciplinary frames, methodological frames are going to shape how you go about that? So that's my ambition, and we're trying to achieve it in some of the following ways. Look, as you know, Fort Hare's done a marvelous tranche of hires. We've hired close on 25 humanities scholars in the cycle of one academic year. And we've now got new academic structures. We had a ton of departments, and we've reduced them to about 6, where the number of disciplines are in each department. So this year, our task in the faculty is to think, and to think what big questions each department is going to address. And as a subsection of that is to think what each discipline brings to that question. Let me give you an example. We've got a Department of Liberation Studies, which is made up of theology, it's made up of the Library and Archival Division, and it's made up in history. And each obviously bring a different set of questions to how we approach liberation, and that's what I want. I'm trying to look for practical ways to have the scholars in our department think about their disciplines. What questions does their discipline ask, and how does it go about answering them? I firmly believe that advanced scholarship must proceed from a really strong conceptual grasp of what the discipline, of what one's discipline does. The next question that each department is asking is how the questions they are asking will help Fort Hare be distinctive. And, you know, I have to go and ask them. I say, well, is NMU or Rhodes or UCT not asking these questions already? Are they not doing this? And from that, we are going to have a colloquium later in the year on knowledge in the social science and humanities. at the University of Fort Hare. We're going to ask questions about whether the idea of the Black humanities is generative or whether it needs qualification. What's distinctive about what we do? To what extent should we be doing applied research, and how do we do it? And what type of teaching do we need to undertake, or what type of transdisciplinary research for that matter as well? As far as younger scholars go, it's a particular interest of mine. A number of the scholars who we have recruited are youngish and can still qualify for Y ratings, and I want to put them on a rating track. Not because of the subsidy or the metrics which come from saying the university now has 5 years or 5 or 10 or 20 or whatever the case might be, Y researchers, but I do feel that the system and the subsidy system have kind of motivated younger scholars to jump around and publish 18 bits of paper, 18 papers a year on absolutely disconnected topics of dubious merit, whereas I want scholars to follow an NRF track, which is again a more intentional, systematic building of bigger intellectual projects and systematically addressing those, which is much like the work myself and my colleague, Professor Jackie du Toit, did under Jonathan's leadership at Free State, and which we do with the Future Professors Program at the moment. So that's an approach which is central to my own role. I see as an academic leader. I've told the HODs that, and my boss shouldn't hear this because I'm sure I'll get fired. I've said, you are going to have lots of administration in your work, but your major job is going to be to cultivate intellectual life in your department. Cultivate what the young scholars are doing. Cultivate what the department as a whole does. Think about whether this reflects in the teaching which you do. So that's very much what I'm trying to do to, one, stimulate intellectual cultures in humanities and social sciences at Fort Hare, and to support career development among younger scholars. And there was an emphasis there on try. I don't know how much success I'll have of these. It'll probably be a little bit in each domain, but not nearly as much as I'd like. That's the nature of things. But that's certainly, as a dean, what I'm aiming at.
Well, Neil, I'm salivating actually.
Yeah, amen to that.
But I will also add, I mean, again, going back to the University of the Free State experience, because I experienced that mentorship from you and from Jackie in terms of applying for an NRF rating. And that was such an eye-opening experience, because before that, as a young scholar, older scholars were constantly telling me my focus is too narrow. I need to, branch out and have wider, a wider range of work. And I never felt comfortable with that. And then I felt validated by you and by Jackie and by the NRF process.
Especially by the NRF, yes.
Exactly, the NRF process that emphasizes a coherent body of work. So, and I thought that actually lets you grow so much further as a scholar. But on that note, we've been talking about, all the various intellectual influences, the amount of theories that you have engaged with, your interdisciplinary approach. We've gone from ethnographies to whiteness to subaltern studies to, everything. Are there other intellectual movements today that you think are exciting and that you want to explore further and engage with?
I'm very interested in in using, again, as I say, each of my bodies of work has been marked by a couple of core historiographic questions. And the one I'm interested at the moment, or in fact, there's two that I'm interested in. The first one is, what do we mean by the social in social history? You know, why is it social? Why do we add social to it? And I'm using the work of Patrick Joyce and the work of Bruno Latour to try and help me figure that out. The second question is whether we can use a history from below, in other words, a social history, howsoever we define that, with all of its caveats and qualifications and currents going into it, to write elements of global history. Those are the two, I suppose, the two strands which interest me at the moment.
Let's end with books. And what is I want to ask about what is your intellectual inspirations in terms of books, and if you were to identify 3 favorite books, what would you answer, and who would make your Mount Rushmore, to misuse that analogy?
Okay, look, none of them are particularly new books, but that's, I think, is the value of them. My favorite book, and it's always been the favorite when I do a poll at the end of teaching survey African history classes, is Isichai's Voices of the Poor, Moral Economies and the Popular Imagination, where she uses many disciplines to explore popular consciousness around the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. And why I love the book is that she takes very, very seriously the question of symbolic meaning created by Africans as a historical source to reshape these major points in a shocking period of history. And I think it's a brilliant book. The next one I would probably put on my list is Comaroffs' Revelation and Revolution, Volume 2, where they look at modernity, they look at evangelism, they look at the transformations which these brought around class formation, around ideology, and they look at the realms of resistance, which lots of people have claimed since that oh gosh, how neat we're looking at resistance around consciousness, but the Comaroffs really set up the stand for that, and I think in Revelation and Revolution. And behind that, in a similar genre, I would put Dipesh Chakrabarty's Rethinking Working Class History in Bengal, 1890 to 1941, because he does very similar things in looking at the types of consciousness which these workers drew on. My third book is a book which I read in second year, actually, and maybe it was the timing that I read it, and that's Perry Anderson's Lineages of the Absolute State, and I love it because it exposed me to Marxist methodologies to show large social changes over a long period of time. It showed very clearly, again to an undergraduate, how class struggles propel social change, and it was in a strong comparative framework. So for me, as a young and impressionable, by then I was an 18-year-old, it showed me the historian's craft, and I loved its magnificent scale and scope. Now, close runners-up, which could take the place of any of these, I guess, are Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, and another book which I love just because of the sheer innovation of it, is Linebar and Rediker's Sailors, Slaves, and Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic.
And I would have sworn for on my life that you would have put E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, and it's not even in the top 5, not even on the B list, Neil. Not even on the B list.
I would have put it, but I put Comaroffs and I put Chakrabarti because both draw so heavily on Thompson's work. I mean, he has to be there, but I was trying to go, for my personal favorite, but he's like the foundation upon which those works, as well as Leinbach, build on.
Let me push you for the South African one.
The South African one, it's, I liked Jonathan's Knowledge in the Blood, but I think for a South African one, I would probably go for Van Onselen's Kasmyne. It was an epic piece of history, that.
So I will say I guessed that you would name Van Onselen and Kasmyne The Seed Is Mine. So I'll give myself a noddy badge for that.
But there's been a lot of absolutely brilliant history, and it's doing these lists always leaves one feel slightly sad and guilty because there's so many good works which one ends up not picking.
That's why we restricted to 3, so you have to make a choice.
I mean, even if we had to go for a small pool, like the works the books which were produced from the International Studies Group, but even then it would be hard, hey? It would not.
Yes, you're not allowed to choose.
No.
Among those books.
No.
Neil, thank you so much. This was, as always, just so enlightening and stimulating, and again just brings us closer to what it means to be a scholar. So thank you to you.
Thank you. It's been a great privilege to speak with my 2 friends and colleagues, but equally it's been a real privilege to have been able to spend my professional life as a professional historian, which I fell into as a result of conscription. I wanted to be a school teacher, and I stayed on to do graduate studies so I wouldn't be conscripted. And well, here I am today talking about something which I love deeply with some colleagues who I admire and respect and whose company I enjoy very much. So thank you so much, Thula. Thank you, Lindie.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.